what I'm going to try to do is talk about the economic and international implications of public protests over U.S. legislation or policies towards the Internet. And my takeaway is that it's not the end of the K Street deals, but rather a new approach to building K Street deals. And I think what this is that some firms, in particular Google and eBay, but we'll just leave it at that, learned how to collaborate with some activists to use the net in their own economic interests. And I'm not sure that the Internet freedom agenda is as altruistic as it makes it seem. And so my own interest here is that I'm working on a project that compares how the US, the EU, and Canada use trade policy to, if you will, govern the Internet. And I want to talk a little bit about public protests outside the United States, and there's been a lot in New Zealand, Australia, but in particular Europe. And what happened? So right now, the protest continues about something called the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement, which is a trade agreement that has gone into force already, but has not been completely accepted by the 27 members of the European Union. And many of the activists in Europe were very upset about SOPA people because they saw it as extraterritoriality, right? It meant that U.S. law could apply in their countries without their assent, if you will. And so this particular trade agreement, which these countries have decided their parliaments must approve first, the U.S. debate is totally different, and we can talk about that later, but 2 million Europeans have signed anti-ACTA petitions, but the protesters didn't just protest in that traditional way. They got down and dirty, and they did some pretty horrible things, like in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, they took private information of parliamentarians who had yet to vote on this and put it on the web. So not only did they name and shame protesters, these legislators, but they punished them even before they voted. They threatened them, if you will. So what you had is, this was, I'm sure, not approved by Facebook and Google. I have no evidence of that, but I am sure of that. But these companies did work with activists to spread the word about what was bad about these attempts to try to govern the Internet. Now, what does the public really think? I would say the polling data is pretty scarce. I know of only 2 polls. The first poll I know of is a 2009 poll of 20,000 people in 22 countries. And the data says, that they found, says on average, so that's an average of all these 22 countries, 62% support unfettered access to the Internet. There's been another more recent poll in the United States, and that was by the American Assembly, and it said 57% oppose blocking and filtering of legal content. That's not a very high majority, if you will, let alone illegal content, which was at 62%. So the public is not, it's not like 80% of people saying. I think that's a sizable amount. And I also think this data is not good enough yet. But the public does seem to have a new conception that they think it's okay to share some things over the Internet. And so they think, I think what they're saying to some extent is Google's position. We need to rethink, if you will, how we define what we can share legally. But on the other hand, I think this battle is very, very worrisome for another reason. I don't know if any of you have been to China or Brazil lately, but these are countries with huge, internet-related companies. And in these countries, their trade policymakers think that the U.S. government and its internet industry are essentially in cahoots to control the Internet. And it is true even in Europe, because U.S. companies are so dominant that, they don't, from my talks with European officials, they don't even feel like they can yet advocate in corporate interests. They feel like they're advocating in the consumer interests. Whereas they see the United States as sort of trying to use trade policy to help these companies control the Internet. I don't think it's that simple, but to Google, as example, if there's censorship of the Internet in a country like China or Romania, That means less eyes on their products and their services, etc., less revenues. So it's harder for them to compete. So they tend to be advocates, if you will, of the Internet freedom agenda. Now, the Internet freedom agenda sounds really good, but it is also, if you will, benefiting companies like eBay and Facebook, whereas if you're a Chinese company, you might see such censorship as in your interest. So, it's not quite as altruistic as it appears. That's not to say it isn't a good agenda. I just don't want you to be, thinking, oh, Google's, mission statement is truly, benign. It's not just do no evil, it's let's build our business too. Okay, so will it be the end of case-free deals? I don't think so, because I would say both the internet content, owners of copyright, etc., they're rent-seeking, as is Google and Facebook, right? Rent-seeking meaning that they use law and legislation and trade policies, etc., to try to make profits or to maximize their market access. So I'd say my best friend Mark Zuckerberg said it best when he said, quote, "We can't let poorly thought out laws get in the way of the internet's development." And he used this comment to explain his company's opposition to SOPA and PIPA. Zuckerberg's not going to abandon his staff on K Street or his friends on Capitol Hill. So let me make some really quick suggestions. First, the Open Act is a really interesting approach. It is a form of crowdsourcing. If you go to that website, they allow you to comment on various provisions of the bill. I did not know they had incorporated any of the comments. It will be interesting to see if they do that. Another solution I would really like to see is, just as we have a Congressional Executive Commission on China, right, how we will govern the internet, and how we'll balance internet freedom and privacy, and ensure that American companies have market access in other countries and vice versa. This is a huge issue, and I'd like to have a Congressional Executive Commission with public hearings where people can comment and try to influence deliberations and come up with a new approach to public policy, because clearly what we're doing right now is out of date and it isn't working. So, but I do think there's no evidence that people want this kind of legislation per se, nor is there evidence that they want trade agreements to govern the internet, or that U.S. laws should have extraterritorial application. So I think our policy responses have to be internationally acceptable, but they also have to be coherent, and we're clearly not there yet. I'm hoping that this kind of activism will be less mean, if you will, less of this naming and shaming, as what happens in the Slovak and Czech legislators, and more of a dialogue.